She flinched when I offered her food, as if kindness was something she had to earn. If you enjoy stories where compassion changes worlds, hit subscribe and stay for more human meets alien tales like this one. The cold on Erath Prime didn't arrive in gusts so much as it seeped. It found seams, habits, and thoughts, and made a patient home there. Calder Blake learned to live with it, the way he lived with everything else in this settlement of welded market stalls and prefabs, by pretending it was normal. He'd come alone on a hauler no one photographed, paying in scraped credits and the last of his pawned tools. Back on the core routes, factories had swapped shift crews for automated lines, and a man with calloused hands and a quiet voice didn't count for much. The rumor out here was simpler. Sisharan merchants still needed humans to lift, fix, and coax dying machines through one more season. Erath Prime wasn't a place you dreamed about. It was a place you reached when dreaming had grown expensive. Calder rented a box of a home at the edge of the East Market, 3 steps across, 4 steps deep, a mattress, a single hot plate, and a heater that coughed like an old dog. In the morning, he woke to frost on the inside of the window, shaved with a dull razor, and warmed his palms over the kettle as if that counted as breakfast. The Sisharan foreman at the freight yard liked him for the same reason most bosses liked him. He showed up, he didn't break what he touched, and he answered questions with tools instead of words. He was also the only human in the district. The Sisharan tolerated him with the careful manners reserved for a guest who might have powerful relatives. Their antennae tilted when he passed, their translator harnesses clicked polite phrases, and their compound eyes generally did not meet his. Tolerated is a thin blanket. It keeps out the worst of the cold, but never the draft. The path from the yard to his prefab wound, straight through the open-air market. Lanterns swung on chains, sending puddles of honey-colored light into the falling snow. He learned the sounds first. The insectoid barter clicks rising and falling like rain on tin, the shrill chirp of a scale failing, the soft laugh of someone counting a profit. The smells followed. Spice warmed in ladles, metal dust, the bite of antifreeze from a stall that repaired heaters while theirs burned. He walked that way every evening, hands jammed into a coat several lives old, eyes down. The safest posture here was to look like you belonged to your own errands. On his second week, he started noticing the pen. It sat half in shadow between a stall that traded fabrics and one that hawked repair parts. A brazier smoldered there, not for comfort. Sisharan disliked flames, but to keep metal from seizing. Against that heat, a line of short chains fed into a single ring sunk in the ice. Sometimes the pen held nothing but a bucket and a sheet. Sometimes it held a quiet cluster of beings who tried not to meet anyone's gaze. Companion stock, a hand-painted placard read in 3 scripts. Calder wasn't naive. He'd been on stations where companionship could be bought by the hour or the year, where contracts blurred the line between employment and owning. He had learned to see things and keep walking because outrage didn't fix machines or pay rent. Even so, he found himself glancing that way in the evenings, the way one glances at a truck idling too near a ledge. That was where he saw her. She sat nearest the brazier, not using its warmth, as if warmth were something that needed asking for. Red hair spilled over the torn collar of a gray dress, made startling by the winter around it. Fox ears, too big for the smallness of her frame, stood canted outward beneath a dusting of snow. Her tail was wrapped around her bare ankles like a scarf someone had forgotten to teach her belonged to her. She was still. Not the stillness of peace. The stillness of a creature who had learned that any motion might be the wrong one. Calder kept walking because that was what he did. But the image lodged in the place the cold liked best. Work on Erath Prime had a rhythm. Morning, bolt guns, pallets, a winch that always squealed on the 3rd rung. Noon, Sisharan lunch bells clacked in triple time, and Calder ate bread softened in stew from a cart that greeted him with that careful politeness. Afternoon, The foreman sent him to diagnose aging loaders that coughed cables and shed belts. And Calder, with patience and a listening ear, persuaded them to keep living. He didn't talk much to the other workers. They didn't talk much to him. Sometimes, the best conversation was with a stubborn piece of machinery, because you both understood what the other wanted: to make it to nightfall. At night, he walked through the market again. The pen was still there. She was still there. The merchant running it was broad in the thorax, with a translator unit strapped like a bandolier. He had the bored confidence of a man selling what the world always buys: companion prime, docile, domestic training incomplete. The translator said in a chipper voice unsuited to winter. Discount on defects. The Sisharan, who paused to listen, leaned close and peered the way one peers at a used appliance that will live under a counter out of sight. Calder, despite himself, slowed. The vulpine woman's eyes, amber, too bright for the dim, flicked to him in a way. Not a plea, not even curiosity. Measurement. How much trouble he would be. He went home. Some nights the heater worked as intended. On others, he wore his coat indoors and warmed his hands over the kettle again. He marked the days with little routines: patch a glove, sharpen a blade, wash a single shirt and hang it in the corner where the damp couldn't pretend to be fog. He wasn't unhappy exactly. Loneliness in his life was a quiet room you made tidy. But the pen kept living in the corner of his eye. On the fourth evening, soft flakes turned heavy, and the market vendors unrolled clear sheeting to keep their wares from disappearing under white. The pen had no sheeting. The brazier hissed and steamed and did its best impersonation of mercy. The merchant talked faster, spitting phrases about value and warmth and company. A pair of Sisharan females approached, tilted their heads, clicked to each other, and walked away. The red-haired woman did not follow them with her gaze. The only movement she allowed herself was a small clench of her toes against the cold, as a person resisting the urge to shiver. Calder found himself standing near the brazier long enough that the merchant noticed him. Human, the translator said, bright as market bells. Browsing? Your species prefers independent stock. This one is quiet, perfectly quiet. Calder's mouth was dry. He hadn't meant to stop. I'm not, he began, and discovered he didn't have an end to that sentence that wasn't a lie. He stepped back until the heat of the brazier faded and the cold took his cheeks again. I'm late for shift, he said instead, though he wasn't. The merchant's antennae wavered in a shrug. Return when schedule allows. Businesses favor companionship in frontier climates. The word businesses caught in his ear like grit. That night the heater gave up entirely. He slept in his coat and was woken by the sound of pipes complaining. In the morning, he repaired them for his landlord without being asked, because repairing things before they broke had gotten him farther in life than speeches ever had. The landlord, an old Sisharan female whose eyes were kinder than most, slid him a credit chit and an extra fuel canister with the air of someone making a bad habit. Human keeps this place alive, her translator admitted, almost fond. Small gift. Calder took it and said thank you, and tried to feel luckier than he did. By the end of the month, he knew the market by sound. The stall that sold spiced roots played a loop of old music every evening. The scrap seller's scale missed by 2 grams when the wind came from the east. And the pen, when the pen was empty, the silence was a relief he didn't interrogate. When it wasn't, he adjusted his pace to pass without pausing, which meant, of course, that he paused. He learned her name without asking. The merchant, on days when the market was slow, would call to her as if speaking to a stubborn tool. Kaylee, the translator would say, chiding. Sit straight. Smile. She would attempt to smile like a person sounding out a word from another alphabet, then let it die when no one looked. On a snow-bright afternoon, Calder bought 2 bowls of stew and carried them to his prefab, one for that night and one for a future when stew might be wishful thinking. He passed the pen. Kaylee's ears twitched at the smell the way candle flames twitch when doors open. Calder stopped, then kept moving, then set one bowl on the low wall by the brazier like a man rearranging a tool he didn't need. He walked away before the merchant could attribute meaning to the act. He did not look back. The next evening, the bowl was gone. He told himself the merchant probably took it. He told himself lots of things. Through it all, life performed its ordinary miracle of continuing. Shifts, aching hands, a repair that earned him a nod from the foreman, a letter from the transport office confirming what he already knew about the cost of going elsewhere. He was not trapped on Aerith Prime, exactly. He simply had nowhere better to be. On an evening when the wind was full of dry glitter and the lanterns haloed everything in soft gold, Calder reached the pen to find Kaylee sitting a little closer to the brazier. Not warmth, still permission. Her eyes followed a pair of insectoid males who argued with the merchant, counted credits, and then scuttled off in irritation. The translator's tone turned sour. Maintenance costs exceed revenue, it muttered, perhaps to itself. Recycling is more efficient than storage. Kaylee's ears didn't move at the word. Perhaps it was too familiar to sting. Calder felt the cold find a new seam in him and sink teeth. He stared at his boots until the snow blurred. He was a practical man. He believed in fixing what was his to fix, in minding his work, in surviving without speeches. But as he stood in the market listening to the brazier hiss and the merchant complain to no one, practicality felt less like wisdom and more like an alibi. He didn't decide anything then. He didn't reach for heroics or for his wallet. He did the only thing he could trust himself to do. He breathed, he turned away, he walked home. And all the way back, the word recycling kept walking with him, patient as winter, taking up residence where the cold had left room. Calder didn't sleep much after that night. The word recycling kept running laps in his skull while the heater stuttered and wheezed beside him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the vulpine woman's tail curled tight around her ankles, and the way the merchant had said it, not cruelly, just efficiently, like scrap metal or spoiled food. He told himself he wasn't getting involved, not in that way. He didn't have the credits, the time, or the sense. But he also didn't have the stomach to keep walking past the brazier and pretend he didn't see her. So he started saving. Quietly, like a man smuggling kindness past his own doubt. He skipped breakfast, sold a few tools to another worker who'd been eyeing his torque driver for weeks, took extra shifts unloading mineral crates. His body complained, his hands cracked from cold and detergent, but the work dulled the noise in his mind. The other Sesharon noticed. "Human working late," one of them remarked with faint amusement. "Trying to prove species durability?" "Trying to stay warm," Calder muttered, and lifted another crate. He lived on ration bars and boiled water for the better part of a week. The ceramic jar on his counter grew heavier with each clink of credit chips. He didn't count them until the 7th night. Even then, he didn't look pleased, just determined. The market was busier than usual that evening. Lanterns flickered in the wind, throwing long gold streaks across the snow. Calder made his way through the crowd, boots crunching softly. The brazier was burning lower now. The merchant had grown lazy about refueling it. Kaylee sat with her arms around her knees, thinner than before. Her fur clumped from melted frost. Calder swallowed hard. He approached the merchant's stall, waited for a pause in the chatter, and spoke quietly. "I want her." The Sesharon tilted his glossy head, translator chirping. "Human wants pet stock?" "She's not a pet." He hesitated, feeling the weight of all the staring compound eyes around them. A mate. I'm buying her as my mate. The word hung there, absurd and heavy. But the merchant's expression changed instantly. A ripple of interest, then greed. Ah, interspecies claim. Legal, less paperwork. He laughed, a clicking, metallic sound. Humans are strange, but credits are credits. How much? Calder asked. The number that came through the translator was insultingly small, and somehow still more than he had. He poured the jar's contents onto the counter, every coin and chit he'd managed to scrounge. That's all of it. The Esesharan counted with efficient movements, mandibles twitching, barely worth the effort of unlocking chain. But fine. Calder tried not to exhale too loudly when the key hit the snow. Kaylee had been silent the whole time, her ears flicking once at the word mate, but otherwise motionless. When he approached, she looked up as if bracing for an order. He crouched to unfasten the collar lock. The metal was colder than ice. When it fell away, she didn't move, didn't even rub the sore skin beneath it. You can stand, he said gently. Her eyes flicked toward him again, uncertain. Where do I go? Home, he said before he'd thought it through. With me. The merchant's laughter followed them out. Enjoy your defective mate, human. Hope she doesn't bite. They walked through the marketplace in silence. Snow softened the sounds of their footsteps. Kaylee's thin clothes weren't made for the cold. After a few minutes, her shoulders trembled visibly. Calder shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her, pretending not to notice the startled look she gave him. The prefab district loomed ahead, dull lights glowing through the snowstorm. When they reached his shack, he opened the door and stepped aside. Inside, it's not much, but it's warm. She hesitated on the threshold like someone expecting punishment for crossing it. Only when he nodded did she step in. The warmth from the heater touched her face and made her blink rapidly. Calder busied himself with the kettle, buying her the space to breathe. Sit down, he said, realizing too late it sounded like an order. I mean, you can sit if you want. Kaylee perched on the edge of the bed, hands in her lap, eyes darting around the small space. Her tail was tucked tightly behind her, more for hiding than comfort. He poured 2 cups of instant broth and handed one to her. She didn't take it. It's food, he said softly. Her voice was barely audible. You'll be angry if I spill. I won't. After a moment, she reached out, fingers shaking as she accepted the cup. She sipped once, then twice, then drained it so quickly he had to look away. He smiled faintly. There's more if you want. She blinked at him, confused. More? Yeah, that's how food works around here. A flicker of something crossed her expression, confusion mixed with disbelief. Then she nodded slowly, clutching the cup to her chest as though afraid it might vanish. He leaned against the counter, watching her try to find a place for herself in his too small home. The heater hummed. Snow ticked faintly against the window. Finally, she said, You. Call me mate? It was a lie, he admitted. They wouldn't sell to a human otherwise. Her ears lowered slightly, unreadable. Then why did you buy me? He thought about lying again, about saying something easy, something that would make sense to her. But the truth came out anyway. Because no one else was going to save you, he said quietly. And I couldn't watch them throw you away. Kaylee stared at him for a long moment. Then she lowered her gaze and whispered, You shouldn't have done that. Maybe not, Calder said. But I did. He didn't press her with questions or promises. He just handed her a blanket and said, You can take the bed tonight. She blinked again, startled. And you? I'll take the floor. It's not the first time. When he finally lay down on the mat near the heater, he caught one last glimpse of her curling under the blanket, eyes still wide open. She wasn't used to warmth, he realized. Not the kind that didn't demand something in return. Outside, the storm deepened. Inside, the room stayed quiet, but for the faint hum of old machinery and the unfamiliar sound of two lives starting to fit into the same silence. The morning after, Calder woke to the sound of movement. Light, careful movement, the kind that tries not to exist. For a moment, he thought it was the heater cycling down again. Then he realized the sound came from Kaylee. She was kneeling near the stove, her ears half lowered, arranging what few dishes he owned in a neat row. She had already cleaned the table, swept the floor, and folded the blanket he'd given her. Everything about her motions was quiet, precise, automatic. The ritual of someone afraid of being caught doing nothing. He sat up slowly, his back cracking in protest. "You don't have to do that," he said. Her hands froze mid-motion. "You don't like it?" "That's not..." He rubbed his face. "You don't have to clean for me. You're not..." He hesitated on the word mine. "You don't owe me anything." Kaylee lowered her head. "It's what I know how to do." He didn't argue, not yet. He knew habits that deep didn't break just because someone said they should. Instead, he stood, poured a little water into the kettle, and gestured. "If you're going to stay here, you should eat breakfast." She blinked. "You mean now?" "Yeah, that's what people do in the morning." He handed her a ration biscuit and a small bowl of rehydrated stew. She held both as if afraid they might be taken away. When she finally ate, she did it silently, glancing at him between bites, as though waiting for correction. Calder tried to keep the conversation easy, almost meaningless. "Do you know where you're from?" Kaylee hesitated. "A breeder's station near the outer rings, I think. We were trained to please." The way she said it wasn't boastful or ashamed, just factual. "I was sold 3 times before they sent me here." He winced. "And no one treated you kindly?" Her ears flicked once. Kindness is confusing. It doesn't last. Calder didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. The day passed slowly. He fixed an air vent, checked the heater coil, and tried to make sense of the fact that he wasn't alone anymore. Kaylee stayed quiet, her presence like the faint scent of warmth after a storm. Delicate, uncertain. When he left for work, she followed him to the door. "Should I wait for you outside?" she asked, voice small. "No," he said immediately. "You'll freeze out there. Stay in. Rest. Use whatever's here." She looked startled. "I can stay? Without orders?" He nodded. That's the whole point. He didn't realize how much that sentence would mean to her until he came home that night. The shack was tidier than he'd ever seen it. His tools were organized, the floor clean, and there was something simmering in the pot, something that actually smelled edible. Kaylee was sitting on the floor near the heater, tail curled around herself, watching the flames as though trying to memorize them. When he stepped inside, she jumped up. "I made food," she said quickly, almost nervously. "I didn't know what you liked, so I copied what you did this morning." He smiled. "That's perfect." She relaxed a little, the tension leaving her shoulders. "You're not angry?" "Not even close." He sat beside her on the floor, both of them holding chipped bowls of stew. It was thin, but warm, and that counted for a lot. Kaylee glanced at him between bites. "Do you always eat sitting down?" "Usually. Why?" "This is Sharon made us eat, standing. So we'd be ready to serve again." He paused mid-bite, trying to imagine that. "Then you'll have to get used to being lazy here." That earned him something fragile, the ghost of a smile. Over the next few days, A rhythm began to form. Calder would work until dusk, then return to find the small space warmer, cleaner, softer somehow. Kaylee began humming quietly when she thought he wasn't listening, simple, wordless tunes that filled the silences he hadn't realized were heavy. But some habits clung stubbornly. She still asked permission for everything, to sit, to eat, to speak. And each time he told her, "You don't have to ask." After the fifth or sixth time, she whispered, "Then how will I know what you want?" "I'll tell you," he said gently. "That's how normal people do it." She frowned faintly, as if normal were a language she only half understood. One evening, when the power flickered and the heater dimmed, Calder fetched his toolbox to repair it. Kaylee sat nearby, watching him work, tail twitching curiously. When he finished, she tilted her head. "You fix things," she said softly, "even broken ones." He shrugged. "That's my job." She studied him for a long moment. "Then why fix me? I'm not your job." He met her gaze. Her eyes were like honey lit from behind, wary but searching. "Because you're not broken," he said. "You've just been told you are?" Kaylee blinked, stunned by the certainty in his tone. Her ears lowered, not in shame this time, but something closer to shyness. That night, after she'd fallen asleep, Calder sat by the heater a long while, staring at the dim glow through his fingers. His home smelled faintly of stew and soap, cleaner, warmer, alive. And for the first time since he'd arrived on Aerith Prime, the silence didn't feel like punishment. When he finally lay down, he caught a small sound from the bed. Kaylee murmuring something half-dreamed, words soft and uncertain. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't answer. He just smiled into the dark, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing, and let the warmth spread, slow and human, into all the places the cold had lived for too long. By the end of the month, the snow had turned to crystal slush, and the settlement's alleys ran with meltwater that gleamed under the market lights. The season's change wasn't much, but it was enough to make Calder's old heater fight less and hum more steadily. It was also enough to show the first real signs that Kaylee was thawing, too. She started leaving small traces of herself around the shack. A folded scrap of cloth she'd sewn into a curtain, a neat line of spice tins she'd traded for cleaning a neighbor's porch, the faint scent of something floral when she brushed her fur dry after washing. Calder never commented, but he noticed. It made the place feel less like a stopover and more like a home that was learning how to exist. Her voice came easier now, though she still hesitated before speaking. Once, when he came in late and exhausted, she surprised him by saying, "You always smell like cold metal and oil. It's comforting." He chuckled, dropping his coat onto the hook. "That's the nicest thing anyone said about my job." Kaylee tilted her head, unsure if she'd said the wrong thing. When he smiled at her, she relaxed, a small but unmistakable change. Every evening they shared the same simple routine. He fixed what broke. She experimented with cooking from whatever ingredients they could afford. And together, they learned how to fill silence without fear. Still, Kaylee carried the invisible weight of old obedience. She woke early to prepare meals, folded her bedding precisely, and asked every few hours, "Do you need something?" One morning, Calder finally asked, "What do you want to do?" She blinked. "I don't understand." "Not what you think I want. What you want. Something that's yours." Her ears flicked back. "We weren't taught that." He smiled gently. "Then we'll learn it." It became their quiet project, teaching her to choose. The first time came over something simple, tea or coffee. She stared at both cups for a full minute before whispering, "Tea." Then she looked up at him, nervous. "Was that right?" He laughed softly. If you picked it, it's right. After that, she began testing her limits. She asked to try using his tools to see how they worked. She chose a new blanket from the market instead of letting him decide. And once, when he was too tired to cook, she insisted on making dinner herself. A stew so spicy he nearly coughed through the whole meal. But he didn't tell her that until she was laughing at his expression. That laugh stayed with him for days. Sometimes, in the evenings, she'd sit near the door and watch the settlement beyond the frosted window. I used to think the stars were for other people, she said one night. The ones who were free. I didn't know what that word really meant. Calder leaned beside her on the frame. Freedom's not a place, he said. It's a decision you get to make every day. Even small ones count. Her tail twitched softly, curling around her legs. Then I think I like this decision. He looked at her profile in the dim light, the way her fur caught the gold from the heater, the quiet calm in her expression. And something in his chest tightened, almost painfully gentle. But he didn't say anything. Not yet. Weeks passed. Kaylee's energy returned with the warmer weather. She explored the outer streets, shyly greeted a few other off-world workers, and even bartered once with a vendor by herself. Calder watched from afar, pretending to fix a pipe while she haggled clumsily but proudly. When she returned, tail swishing in triumph, she presented him with a handful of dried fruit. Traded for cleaning the stall, he overpaid. He grinned. You're a natural at this. I'm learning from you, she said, her tone warm enough that it made him look away before she saw the color rise in his face. But the real change came one night, when she approached him holding the old metal collar she'd kept folded in a rag at the bottom of her trunk. Can you take this apart? She asked quietly. I want to know what made it stay locked. He turned it over in his hands, the tarnished surface catching the light. Are you sure? Yes, she said. I'm not afraid of it anymore. He worked in silence for a while, loosening the screws and prying out the locking mechanism. When it came free with a soft click, he handed her the broken pieces. There, it's just metal now. Kaylee stared at them, then let the fragments spill onto the table. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she whispered, It's strange. I thought I'd feel nothing. But I feel lighter. Calder nodded. You should. She looked at him, eyes glistening faintly. What am I now? He met her gaze without hesitation. Whatever you want to be. Kaylee's lips parted slightly, as if the words carried a weight she wasn't ready to hold. She smiled, small, trembling, real. That night, she didn't retreat to the bed right away. She lingered near the heater while Calder read an old manual, her tail brushing the floor rhythmically. After a long silence, she said, You never ordered me. Not once. I didn't save you to own you, he said. I just wanted you to have a chance. Kaylee turned toward him. Then you gave me more than that. He looked up from the manual. What do you mean? She hesitated, then said softly, You made me feel like I belong somewhere. The words hung between them, fragile as breath. Calder didn't trust himself to answer, so he just nodded and turned another page he didn't read. When he finally put the manual down, she was already asleep in the chair beside the heater, tail curled around herself like a flame at rest. He draped a blanket over her shoulders, his fingers brushing the soft edge of her fur. She stirred but didn't wake, only murmured his name once, quietly, as if testing how it felt to say it. Calder stood there a long time, watching the small rise and fall of her chest. He realized then that somewhere between rescuing her and teaching her to choose, she had changed the way his home felt. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. Outside, the snow melted into black water that reflected the stars. Inside, a foxwoman dreamed without fear. And a man who'd once thought himself incapable of saving anyone finally understood he'd saved himself too. Spring on Aerith Prime was mostly a rumor. The snow melted just enough to reveal the rust and concrete beneath, and the wind carried less bite but more dust. Still, the settlement stirred awake again. Markets louder, foremen stricter, nights shorter. Calder thought it would pass quietly, but he underestimated how quickly gossip moved in a place with so little else to talk about. It started with whispers. A human and a vulpine living together. The pet that wasn't a pet. At first, Calder ignored it. Everybody needed something to chatter about over fermented tea. But then the whispers sharpened into stares. On his way to work, a group of Esesharan vendors paused mid-conversation, their antennae clicking in disapproval. One muttered, "Degenerate species crossbreeding." The translator didn't bother to hide the tone. Calder didn't stop walking, but the words stayed with him all morning like grit in his teeth. At home, Kaylee didn't know. Or if she did, she didn't mention it. She was happier than he'd ever seen her. Still shy, still cautious, but finally smiling without having to apologize for it. She hummed when she cooked, her tail swaying gently behind her as she worked. She'd even made a habit of waiting up for him, sitting near the door with a blanket over her lap, ready to share what she'd seen that day. That night, she told him she'd started talking to a trader who let her help arrange goods. "He says I'm good with colors," she said with quiet pride. "That people buy more when I sort the fabrics by hue." Calder smiled. "Told you you'd pick things up fast." Her ears flicked forward. "Do you think I could earn enough to buy us a new heater next season?" "Maybe sooner," he said. "I've got a few repairs lined up." They shared dinner in easy silence. But after a while, Kaylee's expression grew distant. She traced a claw along the rim of her bowl. "They stare sometimes," she said finally, "when I go outside. I thought it was because I'm new here, but today one of the insectoid females laughed and said, 'Your master must like disobedience.'" Calder froze. "She said that to you?" Kaylee nodded slowly, watching his face. "Did I do something wrong?" I didn't talk back. He shook his head. "You didn't do anything wrong." He set his bowl down a little too hard, broth sloshing over the side. "They just don't understand. They see something different and it scares them." Kaylee's ears tilted downward. "You're angry?" "Not at you." She studied him carefully, tail wrapping around her knees. "Then at who?" Calder sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "At the world. At people who can't tell the difference between kindness and ownership." She didn't answer, just stared into the heater's glow. After a long pause, she said softly, "Maybe I should stay inside for a while, so they don't trouble you." "No," he said immediately, sharper than intended. She flinched, and he softened his tone. "Don't hide. You deserve to walk wherever you want." "But you'll lose work if they complain," she said. "I heard them saying humans are too proud. They might not renew your permit." "I'll manage." Kaylee's gaze met his, uncertain. "Why do you keep choosing what hurts you?" He laughed quietly, tiredly. "Because it's right." The next few days proved her fears weren't unfounded. At the freight yard, Calder noticed his foreman watching him longer than usual. One afternoon, the translator's polite tone turned dry. "Your domestic situation causes talk," it said. "Esesharan employers dislike disruption." Calder didn't look up from the loader engine he was fixing. "My domestic situation is none of their concern." "Correct, but concern spread." The foreman's antennae twitched. Keep discretion, or work may thin. He didn't reply. He finished the repair, turned in his tools, and walked home through a haze of amber light and silent judgment. Kaylee was sitting by the window when he arrived, her tail drawn close, a look on her face he hadn't seen in months. Fear, quiet and old. "They said something again, didn't they?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Yeah. Nothing worth repeating." She hesitated, then whispered, "Maybe I should leave. Find another place. I'm only making trouble." Calder's hands clenched. "You think I'd let that happen?" "I think you're losing friends because of me." "I didn't have any friends here to begin with," he said dryly, then softened. "Kaylee, listen. You don't have to go anywhere. Not now, not ever." Her throat bobbed. "Then why do you do this? You could have just walked away that day." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Because I couldn't stand watching the world break another good thing just because it didn't understand it." Her eyes widened, pupils dilating faintly in the lamplight. For a moment she looked like she might speak, but the words tangled on her tongue. Instead, she nodded once and turned toward the heater. They ate dinner in silence. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying dust and whispers through the cracks of the settlement. Later, when he was half asleep, Calder heard her voice in the dark, hesitant, trembling, but sure. "I don't understand freedom yet," she said softly. "But I know I feel safe when you're near." He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "That's enough for now." He listened as her breathing slowed beside him, steady and calm, even as the outside world grew colder. By morning, the rumor had a new shape. Not that he'd bought a vulpine, but that he'd fallen for one. Calder didn't bother denying it, not to them, not even to himself. A few weeks passed before Calder realized how much the rumors had changed the air around them. Not openly. No one spat at him or threatened him. But the way doors closed a little faster when he passed, the way voices dipped when Kaylee's name came up. Even the Mechanics Guild started assigning him fewer shifts, polite excuses that never fooled him. Kaylee noticed too. She grew quieter, her steps softer, her tail always close to her body. She stopped humming when she cooked. Calder hated it, the way fear had crept back into her like frost, reclaiming ground it had lost. Then one evening, as he was repairing a cracked pipe behind the stove, she said without turning from the window, "You shouldn't lose work because of me." He dropped the wrench with a clang. "Don't start that again." "I mean it," she said, still watching the snowfall outside. "They'll keep punishing you until you send me away." He stood and wiped his hands. "Kaylee, look at me." Her ears flicked back, but she turned. "You're not something I can send away," he said. "You're a person. You live here. This is your home too." She stared at him, searching for a lie, then whispered, "No one has ever said that to me." "Then they should have," he said simply. Something in her expression softened, like ice cracking under sunlight. But she didn't reply. That night, she stayed awake long after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling as if trying to believe the words were real. The following week, Kaylee surprised him. When he returned from work one evening, exhausted and ready to collapse, he found her waiting by the door, dressed in a heavy scarf and a second-hand coat that hung loosely from her shoulders. "Come with me," she said. "To where?" "You'll see." They stepped outside together, into the chill air of the upper market district. The settlement's lights shimmered through thin flakes of snow. The same stalls that once looked harsh and alien now glowed softly under the lanterns. Kaylee's tail brushed against his leg as they walked, and he realized she wasn't hiding it anymore. They passed curious stares, a few murmurs, but she didn't shrink. Her chin was high, her eyes bright. Calder followed her through the crowded lanes, until they reached the same brazier where he had first seen her months ago. The merchant was still there, the same Sisharan with his translator harness and his cruel laugh. He looked up from his ledger, surprised. "Well," the device chirped, "the human returns. Is this trade or complaint?" Kaylee spoke before Calder could. "Neither." Her voice was steady. The merchant's antennae twitched. "The property speaks now?" "I was never property," she said. "He bought my life, not my obedience. You should remember that next time you sell one." A hush rippled through the nearby stalls. Calder's throat tightened. The merchant clacked in irritation. "Vulpine arrogance. You were worth less than your chain." Kaylee smiled faintly, unbothered. "Then it's a good thing he paid with kindness instead." Before the merchant could reply, she turned and took Calder's hand. "Let's go." He followed her, wordless, stunned, and proud all at once. They walked until the market's noise faded behind them. Kaylee didn't let go of his hand, even as the cold reddened her fingers. Finally, when they reached the quiet edge of the district, she looked up at him. "When you said I was your mate, that day in the market," she said softly, "did you mean it?" Calder stopped walking. The question landed heavy between them, a truth waiting for air. "Back then," he said, "it was the only way to save you. And now?" He hesitated, breath misting in the cold. "Now it's not a lie anymore." Kaylee's ears twitched, uncertain. "You mean that?" "I do." The silence stretched, filled only by the wind. Then slowly, her tail brushed around his leg, tentative as a heartbeat. She stepped closer, her breath warm against the chill. "You shouldn't say things you don't mean, Calder Blake," she whispered. "I don't." She searched his face, amber eyes gleaming under the falling snow. Whatever she found there made her shoulders relax. Then, with a small, trembling smile, she said, "Good, because I don't think I could survive being owned again. But being chosen, that might be different." Calder exhaled, something inside him uncoiling. "Then we'll call it that. Chosen. Chosen." They walked back hand in hand. The settlement still watched, but he didn't care anymore, and she didn't seem to either. At home, Kaylee curled up by the heater, her tail wrapped around both of them this time. The silence wasn't heavy. It was comfortable, like warmth shared without needing permission. When the light from the heater painted her fur in gold and copper, she looked up at him and said, almost playfully, "You realize the Sisharan will think we're truly mated now." He smiled. "Let them think what they want." Kaylee's tail flicked once, brushing his knee. "Then I suppose we'll have to act the part." He raised an eyebrow. "And what does that mean?" "It means," she said, with that same quiet defiance that had silenced an entire market, "that I get to sit beside you instead of across from you." Calder chuckled and shifted, making room. She leaned against him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. And for a while, neither of them spoke. The sound of the heater filled the room. Outside, the snow fell thick and silent. Kaylee's voice broke the quiet at last. "You gave me a life, Calder. I don't know what I can give you in return." He turned his head, his words soft but certain. "Just keep living it." Her tail flicked again, curling gently around his arm, as if sealing the promise. And for the first time since he'd arrived on Aerith Prime, Calder realized that maybe this place wasn't so cold after all. Winter crept back in late, as if the season had forgotten something and returned to fetch it. The wind traded dust for glittering frost. Market lanterns cut sharper circles from the dark. Inside the prefab, warmth settled like a habit neither of them wanted to break. Kaylee began inventing rituals. In the supper mornings, she tied a strip of blue cloth around her wrist. So, I remember I can choose a color, she said, teasing him with a glance that made the heater's glow feel unnecessary. At midday, if Calder's shift ran long, she walked to the yard with a tin of seasoned roots and waited by the gate, tail swaying in quiet arcs. The Esesharon workers learned to step around her, not because they approved, but because the calm in her posture made argument look childish. In the evenings, she spread a woven mat she'd bartered for with small chores, and the two of them ate on the floor like campers decades removed from their nearest forest. Some judgments lingered, but they began arriving softened at the edges. A vendor who once snickered at Kaylee now rounded their prices down. The old Sesharon landlady left a bundle of fuel outside the door with no note. Calder accepted these micro-shifts without ceremony. He trusted the slow turning of weather more than declarations. One night, a power cut swept across the district, washing every window to black. Breath steamed in the sudden chill. Calder found his toolbox by memory and started stripping the panel beside the door. "Talk to me," he said, half to stay present, half to keep her from thinking of the dark outside. "About what?" Kaylee asked, voice a steady metronome in the gloom. "Anything?" She thought for a moment. "When I was little, a breeder taught us to fold paper birds to keep our hands busy. We used scraps from packaging. I made one out of a receipt once, and the numbers made it look like the bird wore a pattern." A small smile warmed her voice. "He called it useless. I kept it anyway." Calder's finger found the brake. Useless things make good anchors. Kaylee moved close enough that he could sense her without seeing her. "You, then," she said softly. "You are a useless thing." He laughed, the sound reverberating in the hollow walls. "I'll add that to my resume." "I mean, you feel like an anchor," she corrected, tail brushing his boot. "I like that." He twisted the final conductor, and the heater rumbled awake in a soft amber bloom. In the half-light, her eyes were bright coins. A curl of hair had escaped the scarf at her neck. He wanted to thumb it back into place and didn't, because the wanting itself felt like a respectful guest who should knock. "Come here," she murmured, as if reading the thought. She lifted his hand and set it against the curve of her scarf, a permission as clear as summer. He touched the stray thread of hair and the pulse under it, both delicate, both alive. They sat by the heater until the cut ended and the settlement flickered back to light. Kaylee unfolded a small cloth bundle and revealed something he hadn't seen. A thin ring braided from copper wire and a sliver of blue enamel. "I made two," she said, suddenly shy. "Bartered for the enamel with the fabric seller. I thought mates should have something. They chose together, even if it's simple." Calder held the ring like it might sing. "Kaylee, I know it isn't law," she rushed on, "and I know the Sesharon don't care for our words. But it's a circle, and circles mean we return, even after small distances." He tried the ring. It fit with an honesty that stole language from him. He reached for the second and slipped it onto her finger. Her breath slowed, steadying into the kind of silence that measures joy rather than fear. The next day, boldness carried them to the market again. Kaylee wore the blue cloth and the ring, and whenever disapproving antennae twitched, she smiled as if to say the weather would change whether anyone argued with it or not. They bought thread, a packet of sweet powder, a dented tin cup with a flower pressed into its side. The merchant at the brazier pretended not to see them. His pretense no longer mattered. Near the end of the lane, the fabric seller waved Kaylee over. "Color order?" his translator asked, less curt than before. "Not tonight," Kaylee said, and surprised Calder by pointing at a bolt of soft gray. "That one, please. It looks like morning before the sun decides." She glanced at Calder, cheeks lifting. "For curtains. You hate waking up with the light in your eyes." He hadn't told her that. He paid without haggling, letting the small domestic fact fill him like a meal. At home, Kaylee measured the window with the seriousness of a shipwright. She pricked her finger once and frowned in concentration until the curtain hung true. When the last stitch was tied, she stepped back and curled her tail around his calf. "There," she declared. "Proof this place intends to be a home." He leaned against the doorframe, suddenly ridiculously full. "And its occupants?" She pretended to consider. "They intend to be patient with each other and curious. And chosen." The word settled like a warm hand over an old bruise. He crossed the room, and when he reached her, he didn't talk. He just pressed his forehead to hers, a slow joining of gravity points that required no translator. Her ears tilted forward, alert and unafraid. "Thank you for surviving long enough to find me," he whispered. "Thank you for seeing me when I wasn't trying to be seen," she returned. They ate late. He sprinkled the sweet powder into their tea and made a face. She laughed, then stole his cup and drank the rest, declaring it educational. Later they lay on the floor beside the heater, shoulder to shoulder, naming shapes in the hairline cracks of the ceiling. The rings touched when their hands did, a soft clink that sounded like a promise repeated until it became identity. Outside, frost began to trace the window again. Inside, the new curtain held the night a respectful arm's length away. When sleep came for them, it found them the way winter had found the settlement. Together, deliberate, settled for a while. The morning would bring its usual catalog of chores and glances and slow changes. The rumor would never fully die, just evolve into the story neighbors told with a shrug. But tonight, the world had narrowed to a room that smelled faintly of stitched fabric and copper, to a curtain that meant choice, to the simple weight of another heartbeat close enough to count. No contracts, no chains. Only 2 rings that fit, 2 cups cooling on a mat, and the soft assurance that kindness, practiced daily, hardens into something like vow. The snow thawed slow that year. Aerith Prime didn't welcome spring, it negotiated with it. The markets came back to life one stall at a time, as though the planet itself wasn't entirely convinced it deserved warmth. Yet for Calder and Kaylee, the cold no longer felt like something to survive. It was simply the world outside their door. The rumor that had once followed them everywhere began to wear out its legs. The settlement had moved on to new scandals. A broken trade contract, a new mining permit, a Sasharan council dispute. In time, the human and his foxmate became background color, no longer a spectacle. And the strange thing was, once no one cared, life became oddly peaceful. Calder took more repair jobs, some for barter, some for credits. And Kaylee started helping him. Her hands were smaller, better for tight spaces, and she had a knack for seeing where parts fit before he did. She learned to identify wires by smell, metals by sound. Sometimes, while she worked, her tail would sway in rhythm to the hum of machinery, a kind of instinctive focus that always made him smile. At first, the Sasharan clients refused to speak to her. They addressed all instructions to Calder, ignoring Kaylee completely. But she learned patience from him, the slow, quiet kind. She answered questions even when they weren't directed at her. And before long, they stopped pretending she wasn't there. Her calm was disarming, her efficiency undeniable. Soon, word spread that the human's mate could fix things better than most apprentices. Even the guild grudgingly began to accept her presence, not out of kindness, but necessity. Calder watched it happen with quiet pride, each small moment a victory too ordinary for applause. At home, Kaylee started to fill their shared space with signs of life. She grew herbs in little tins on the windowsill, traded woven cloth for old paperbacks, and hung a few handmade charms by the door. Circles of twine bound with bits of glass and copper wire. "For luck," she said. "Does it work?" Calder teased. "Of course," she replied with a smile. "You haven't fallen through the floor yet, have you?" Their days took on a rhythm that didn't need planning. Mornings were coffee and quiet. Afternoons were filled with tools and laughter and the occasional shared curse when a bolt stripped wrong. Evenings were for the heater and stories. Sometimes she'd tell him about the stars seen from the breeder's station, how they used to pretend each one was a place they'd never belonged to. Sometimes he told her about Earth, the smell of rain on old metal, the sound of wind through real trees. Kaylee would close her eyes and listen as if building those memories for herself. "If you ever go back," she said once, "take me with you." He smiled faintly. "It's a long way." "I don't care about distance," she said. "Only direction." That became one of her small sayings. Whenever things were difficult, whenever the day felt heavy, she'd murmur it, "Only direction." And somehow, it made the world smaller and kinder again. The settlement changed around them, little by little. A few Sisharan youths began stopping by Calder's shack for lessons in basic repair work. At first, they came for free help, but Kaylee started charging in trade: spices, cloth, polished glass. She even had a small following among off-worlders who admired her work. One evening, an older Sisharan female approached their door carrying a damaged thermal coil. Kaylee fixed it in 15 minutes and refused payment. The alien hesitated, antennae twitching. "You treat this planet like home," her translator said, tone uncertain. Kaylee looked at Calder, then back at her. "It is home," she said simply. Word spread after that. Not a rumor this time, but something gentler. The foxmate wasn't a scandal anymore. She was a fixture, a part of the market's fabric. People greeted her with nods instead of sneers. The merchant who had once sold her avoided her eyes altogether now, and that, Calder thought, was victory enough. They celebrated small milestones quietly. The first warm night without the heater, the day the herbs bloomed, the moment they managed to afford a second blanket just because it was soft. These things mattered more than any grand declaration. Kaylee still had traces of old habits, flinches that surfaced during storms, the reflexive apology when she dropped something. But they came less often. She was learning, slowly, that the world didn't collapse when she made mistakes. Calder's patience was her reassurance, and her laughter was his. One night, as they sat outside watching the twin moons rise over the frozen horizon, Kaylee said softly, "When I was chained in that market, I used to dream someone would say my name without owning it." She looked at him. "You did." He reached over, brushing a stray lock of fur from her cheek. "It's a good name. Deserves to be said." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And yours," she murmured. "It sounds like a promise when I say it." They sat like that until the cold crept back in, watching their breath mingle in the starlight. By the time the first real thaw came, the settlement no longer treated Kaylee as novelty. The locals still whispered sometimes, but it was the kind of whisper reserved for neighbors, curious, not cruel. Children pointed at her tail, with delight instead of fear. Calder and Kaylee became, somehow, part of the rhythm of the place. Ordinary. And that was the rarest miracle of all. In the evenings, they walked through the same market where they had first met. The lanterns looked different now. Less harsh, more human somehow. Sometimes she'd stop by the brazier just to warm her hands, smiling at the memory. "You know," she said one night, "I used to hate this place. Now, It's the first world that ever gave me something back. Calder chuckled. Guess it's got good taste. Her tail flicked playfully against his leg. No, that's just you. And under the steady fall of soft spring snow, they walked together. Two shapes in the half-light, no longer an oddity, no longer rumor or pity or scandal. Just a human and his mate, heading home to the warmth they'd built with nothing but courage, patience, and the quiet power of kindness. The seasons turned, and for once, Calder noticed, not because of the work schedule or the markets, but because Kaylee kept track of them. She marked the first green shoots that pushed through Aerith Prime's frozen soil, the first soft rain that didn't freeze midair, and the first evening warm enough to open the door without shivering. Their home, the same little prefab that once smelled like rust and reheated soup, now carried the scent of herbs, fabric dye, and tea. Kaylee's touch was everywhere. Woven mats, patched curtains, jars of preserved roots, tiny projects in progress. The space felt alive, but never crowded. Calder often said it was like living inside a heartbeat. Work had steadied again. The guild no longer cared who lived in his house as long as his repairs stayed on schedule. The insectoid foreman even nodded to him one morning, a small but significant concession. Efficient partnership, the translator had said. Your mate increases productivity. Calder had laughed all the way home. When he told Kaylee, she grinned, eyes bright. See? They just needed time. He'd shaken his head. No, they needed proof. And we gave it to them. The world had grown easier in quiet increments, and the two of them filled it with unhurried joys. Sometimes, after dinner, Kaylee would coax him to dance, not the kind with rhythm or rules, just a slow swaying in the cramped space between table and bed, her tail brushing softly against his side as they turned. You move like a repair droid, she'd tease. And you talk too much for someone who said she can't sing, he'd reply, and she'd laugh until her ears folded. They were learning that love didn't always arrive in grand gestures or sudden declarations. Sometimes it came as the way she reached for his hand without thinking, or how he always brewed her tea before his own. It came in warmth shared quietly, in knowing silences, in small mutual rituals that replaced fear with comfort. One night, as a light rain tapped the roof, Kaylee stood by the window watching droplets slide down the glass. Do you remember, she said, how you told me freedom was a decision? He nodded, setting down his wrench. Yeah, I think I finally understand. She turned, tail flicking gently. It's not just being allowed to live, it's being able to choose how. Calder smiled. Then what do you choose? She stepped close, her voice a soft whisper against the steady patter of rain. I choose to stay, to build, to keep learning what this feeling is. He reached for her hand, rough palms against soft fur. Then that's freedom, Kaylee. Right there. She looked down at their joined hands, then up at him, her amber eyes reflecting both the lamplight and something deeper. Do you think it'll last? He considered that, then nodded. If we keep choosing it every day. They never married by law. Aerith Prime didn't recognize such things. But the settlement began referring to them as bonded nonetheless. Kaylee started selling her own crafts. Small woven bracelets threaded with copper, little tokens she said represented threads of choice. They became strangely popular among travelers who passed through. Some bought them for luck, others for love, and some simply because they felt right in the hand. She never raised her prices. If it makes someone smile, that's enough, she said whenever Calder teased her about undervaluing her work. He built her a new workbench out of old freight crates. She filled it with color, spools of thread, small tools, scraps of cloth. Every creation she made carried a signature. a single strand of blue thread, the color she'd chosen for herself that first spring. Sometimes, late at night, she'd fall asleep over her work, tail draped lazily across the stool. Calder would lift her gently, carry her to the bed, and whisper, "You've earned your rest, little maker." She always murmured something in reply, half asleep, half dreaming, usually his name. The day Kaylee's first green herb sprouted a bloom, she ran to him like a child. "Look, it's alive." He smiled, kneeling beside her. "You did that?" "No," she said, tail flicking. "We did. You built the shelf, remember?" He laughed. "I suppose that makes us gardeners now." "Then we should plant more," she said, her eyes glimmering with that fierce, bright hope that always undid him. "Maybe outside when the frost is gone, something that will survive here. Something stubborn," he said. "Something like us." She tilted her head, amused. "Then it'll have to be tough." "Definitely," he said, smiling. "But beautiful, too." Her cheeks flushed beneath the fur, and she looked away, pretending to inspect the plant. "You say things like that and then expect me to focus." He chuckled. "I don't expect you to. That's half the fun." As months passed, their lives wove into the rhythm of the settlement. Sometimes they worked together, sometimes apart, but always returned to the same space, the same warmth, the same quiet understanding. They didn't talk about the past much anymore. It wasn't forgotten, it just wasn't where they lived. When memories surfaced, they shared them softly, not as pain, but as proof of distance traveled. Kaylee often sat by the window at dusk, watching stars blink through the thin atmosphere. "Do you think they still talk about us?" she asked once, meaning the Sisharan, the traders, the ones who had doubted them. Calder smiled, leaning beside her. "Maybe. But not for the same reasons." "What reasons then?" "Because we made it," he said. "Because we stayed." She nodded slowly. "Then let them talk." And they did. About weather, about the markets, about a human and a vulpine who had managed to build something like peace out of scraps and stubbornness. That night, Kaylee curled her tail around him as they lay in bed, her voice a soft murmur. "When I first came here, I thought freedom would be loud, that it would shout and sparkle. But it's quiet, isn't it?" "Quiet's better," Calder said, eyes half closed. "It means it's real." She smiled, pressing her forehead to his chest. "Then this is real." He placed a hand on her back, feeling her breathe, slow, steady, alive. "Yeah," he whispered. "This is what freedom feels like." The rain outside softened into mist. Inside, the room glowed with dim warmth. 2 rings glinted faintly on the table beside them, symbols not of ownership, but of choice freely made and renewed every morning. The heater clicked once, settling. Kaylee sighed, content, and the sound blended with his own slow breath until there was no telling one from the other. Eritha Prime kept spinning outside, cold and complicated and imperfect. But in that small corner of it, 2 souls had rewritten the rules of belonging. And sometimes, that was all the galaxy needed to change. If this story warmed your heart, subscribe for more HFY sci-fi romances filled with hope, healing, and humanity.